Hi, and welcome to another episode of Here's the Deal. I'm Jennifer Simpson. Today we're going to be discussing a topic that's gaining a lot of traction within the HD community. And we have two very special guests with us here today, the wonderful Jeff and Megan Carroll. You might know Jeff and Megan from some of their discussions they've had at convention. They've talked a little bit about family planning, their experiences with PGD-IVF, and they're here to talk with us today about their experiences with PGD, with IVF, and their thoughts on the whole process. So welcome, Jeff and Megan.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So first, I want to just kind of talk to you guys a little bit about your connection with Huntington's disease. Although I know a lot of people might know you guys, might know especially you, Jeff, from your dynamic duo of Ed and Jeff and HD Buzz. Tell us a little bit about how you're impacted by Huntington's disease.
So my mom died of Huntington's disease. My grandmother was affected. So obviously, my family was affected even when I was born, but we didn't know it was Huntington's that ran in the family. We knew my grandma was sick and she was in a nursing home early and she sort of kind of disappeared from our family, but we didn't really know what was happening. And then it was only when my mom started getting sick and we kind of couldn't avoid the obvious anymore. Actually, shortly after Megan and I got married, my dad sat Megan and I down and said, not only is your mom at risk for this thing, but she actually has symptoms of the disease. And in fact, at that time, she was living by herself and couldn't kind of cook and take care of things and drive and stuff. So she was sort of becoming symptomatic. And so we went through the same thing at that point that, all HD families go through in terms of learning about it and my mom's progression. She progressed pretty fast, and she had some kind of acute complications of being in a nursing home and actually passed away relatively soon after becoming that ill. So she died when her kids were just born. So
2006?
Yeah. So about 12 years ago.
Okay.
So we've kind of run the whole gamut, and then since then we've been very involved at different levels. So I'm a researcher and scientist. I work in run a lab that studies HD basic biology. We do a lot of work in terms of community outreach and going to conventions and talking to people and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm. So that was sort of, you guys got this information, it sounds like almost on your honeymoon. Sort of, here's your wedding
had a
gift.
honeymoon.
Yeah. If we were rich enough to have had a honeymoon. We came home from Christmas. Jeff was in the Army, and his dad sat us down in the kitchen and said that your mom has Huntington's disease. And Jeff went, oh my God, and freaked out, literally freaked out, like left the house, just mad. I had no idea what was going on because this was the first time that I'd even ever heard of Huntington's disease, and I didn't know why it was so bad.
Yeah.
And so I had to sort of like wrap my head around that a little bit more than Jeff because I didn't have any I had no exposure to it previously, so.
So it's almost sort of like you really got thrown into the deep end of this world very quickly. So, Jeff, when you learned of your mom's diagnosis, what was the sort of point where you decided, okay, I think I need to find out for myself what my status is?
Yeah, I've talked with people over the years, and people often kind of ask, like, what was your decision-making process or whatever around the decision to test? And I didn't really perceive it as a decision. I mean, to me, as soon as I knew my mom was at risk, and therefore I had a 50% chance. I knew immediately that I would get tested as soon as I could. It was just a matter of like when. And so, as Megan said, I was in the Army at that time. I was stationed in Germany, and so I actually started to I tried to start the process right away there. This was 99.
Mm-hmm.
And 1999, and so there was very bad information, even at good hospitals. And I'm at some military hospital; nobody knows what HD is. It was very odd. And so I didn't immediately get tested. It took another year and a half or so until I got home from the Army and we got settled in Vancouver, BC. But for me, it was like a when, not if. Yeah.
So it's sort of this feeling of I need to get this knowledge. If it's out there and I can have it, I need to know.
Right. And I didn't really ever entertain not knowing. So it's a little bit hard for me, just personality-wise, I think, to relate to that dilemma. And people totally have that dilemma. It's just a different response to that news. But for me, it was the other way. It was like, okay, I need to know as soon as possible.
Yeah. So after you got your testing results, you guys are obviously relatively newlyweds, thinking about your lives together, thinking about how you're going to build your families. Did your testing result, Jeff, did that impact how you thought about your family planning or your vision of how you would build your family?
Oh, absolutely. Because like when he found out that he was at risk, it was sort of like, we can never have children if I have this disease. Like we will never have our own children. And so that was like a huge thing to also, again, wrap my head around. Like, it's like, oh, like we could start a family eventually when we got home from the Army. But we kind of put all of those feelings on the shelf until we knew what was going to, like, until Jeff tested.
Yeah.
We just kind of actually, I think for almost 2 years, just before he got tested, we kind of started like normalizing and having like a regular life and sort of like being like young married couple without children. And so
Those were the days.
those were the days.
Hey, 2 income, no kids. It's not bad.
We went from no kids to 2 kids. Yeah, so we just didn't even, we kind of like shelved those feelings until we could do something proactive about Jeff getting tested, I think. And that's when we started talking again about children, was like, if Jeff was positive, then we weren't having children. If, and I can remember sitting in the waiting room and just the time that it took to get that result, and knowing that that was like one of the fates that we were looking at was like so long but so short. Like we were in sort of like a virtual sort of like time warp.
Yeah, because it feels like on the other end of this result is this future that
Yeah.
is not what you planned for,
Right.
in any sense of,
Yeah.
Especially as newlyweds. You guys are only a couple years into your marriage. I think a lot of people, when they get married, they have a lot of plans for their lives, thinking about, okay, when will we buy a house? When will we start having our family? What schools we want them to go into.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have, a positive gene result. And at that moment, there's this feeling like, no, all of that's going to be gone.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty devastating thing to feel. When did you start to have those thoughts about, well, maybe there is another way, because obviously for you guys, not wanting to pass on HD was a pretty huge part of your family planning decision.
Like that was never even a question. Like we just did not want to pass on HD.
Yeah.
And I think some of those conversations started actually as a result of genetic counseling, just in general, the conversations around family planning, because I was a little bit bitter that we had to go through this counseling process. Because, I was like, by then I was a scientist and I was like, I don't need this crap, like this is all this touchy-feely stuff. Like I know the facts. But it was actually, like it is for a lot of people, it was really useful. And I think our genetic counselor asking us questions about like, oh, well, what would, either outcome that happens as a result of this test, like how will that impact your family planning decisions? And I think that kind of sparked some conversations directly that it might have taken a little while to get towards ourselves. And I think we decided that we wouldn't have kids in a scenario where the kids would be at risk for HD, and that was kind of our starting point. And then from there, it just slowly built up that there were other options, and starting to explore and think about those took a bit of time.
PGD wasn't an option when...
I think technically it existed out there in the world. It wasn't widely available.
Yeah.
It's not something that the genetic counselor said, oh, and also there's this process. Although by then, there was at least clinics trying it commercially, and it had been done, academically a bit.
So just to sort of clue everyone in, we say PGD-IVF, and I think to a lot of people that just sounds like word salad.
Yep.
So take us through, what is PGD-IVF?
Oh, is this my job?
This is your job. Scientist.
Yeah.
So it's sort of two different procedures that got lumped together. And so IVF just means in vitro fertilization. In vitro just means like in a dish. And so it's what it sounds like. You take an egg and sperm cells, you mix them together in a dish. And that's often done for all kinds of issues. So for fertility problems, all kinds of things. And so that part of it is a pretty standardized procedure now, because, tens of thousands of people do that in the U.S. every year, not for HD, but for other reasons. And so the PGD part is what makes it kind of special for HD, and PGD stands for pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. And so pre-implantation just means you're testing the embryo before it's implanted back into the woman, and genetic diagnosis just means you're going to run a genetic test. And so what they do is they take that fertilized egg, they kind of babysit it in a dish. Well, I guess they're literally babysitting it in a dish for a few days until it multiplies and it's like 16 or 32 cells or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
They grab one of them, which is harmless to the embryo, it just divides again and replaces it. And they take that one cell and they rush it off. Actually, it's very funny. A human courier person puts it in like a briefcase, gets on a plane and goes to, in our case, to Detroit. And there's a lab there you have to be super good at what you're doing to test a single cell, right?
Yeah.
And so this lab exists in Detroit, and I always imagine the person like rushes there with the like briefcase, and like they run the test in the middle of the night whenever they get there, and they call back to the clinic and they say, embryos number 1, 3, and 7 don't have HD, the rest of them do, and then you can just use that information to simply pick the embryos that you implant that don't have HD.
Right. So you then make the decision, okay, we want to use these gene negative embryos, implant those,
right,
so that we can ensure that the child that is then born will live their lives free of HD.
Right. And so critically, you haven't modified or did anything to the embryos. All you've done is just count them basically and say which ones are affected and which ones aren't.
So obviously that's a very personal choice that you guys make as a couple, you make with your physicians. When was the point where you became aware that this was even something you guys could do as a family planning option? Because you have kids who are not newborns, right? They're
12.
Okay, they're 12 at this point.
Yeah,
so,
almost 13.
Oh, God. Best of luck. Okay. So when did you guys become aware that this was possible?
So his mom used to like send us articles on different sort of like reproduction sort of methods.
Then you're like, I can't open these at work. No.
She was really excited about sort of like, because obviously she wanted grandchildren. Like we were like, I was going to say the first married couple, but Stacy and Scott were married. But we were like the first sort of like couple that were sort of like in child sort of mode. And she sent us this one article. I think it was the amnio. And just sort of like, you can do amnio, like, so you can get pregnant, test the baby.
Right, like a prenatal diagnosis. Which is funny because my mom was like super religious.
Yeah.
And so became quite flexible around, when she wanted to have grandkids.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and we noted that as well. Like, this was not something that she would normally have considered herself, like as a religious person, but then as an HD person, she also didn't want to see her grandchildren suffer with this.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so it wasn't. We were trying to talk on the way over here and remember exactly what the first time we ever heard of PGD was, and I might have read about it in like a science journal article kind of situation. It might have been more of like my day job where I had read about it, and PGD-IVF had been done. Kind of a long history of being done, like almost as a science experiment, like in the lab. People have done one-off pregnancies kind of to prove that it could work. But it wasn't commercially available very widely at the time. And so once, I wish I could remember, but once we had kind of made this initial connection that you could, I guess we should say, we had considered the option of prenatal diagnosis, but, the outcome from that, if you find out the kid is positive, is supposed to be that you terminate the pregnancy because otherwise you'd be testing someone against their will, and that's tricky ethically. And, we had kind of decided that we weren't comfortable with that, like, for ourselves. And so then as we kind of researched a little bit more, we found out about PGD-IVF sort of in theory, and then we tried to kind of, practically speaking, find somewhere to do it. And, we were living in Vancouver, BC at the time, and there were no clinics sort of advertising that they did it. There was one in Montreal and one in Toronto, and we started conversations with both of them, and we were going to maybe have to like fly back to the East Coast and do it. And then somewhat randomly, we just got lucky that a clinic in Vancouver started commercially, just you could come in and pay for it and do it. And so we went and met with them, and it wasn't super reassuring because they're like, well, it's never worked here before.
Well, yeah, no, I don't think they'd ever done it before.
They'd done it, but not successfully.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah, like there was like, we were going to be...
The real feeling of being guinea pigs.
Yeah.
We were guinea pigs.
Yeah. And I'm really interested knowing that your mom's sort of background, when you made this decision, did you guys have any difficult conversations with other family members where they thought this is a terrible idea or
I don't know.
like
I think when it comes to like making healthy kids, I think people kind of people who have ideas that suggested that this isn't ethical or whatever, they tend to kind of check those at the door when it comes to healthy kids, I think, or at least respect people's privacy enough to say, look, you know, maybe I wouldn't do that, but it's not my kid, it's not my family. So
Yeah.
And I feel like we had nothing but support from all of your family, including his mom, because she was excited about the potential of having grandbabies.
Yeah, I mean, she was quite ill by then, and she was in that stage where, I mean, a lot of HD families will know she kind of didn't care about things that she used to care about. You know, sometimes I feel like as people start getting symptomatic with HD, they actually stop being anxious about things they used to be, kind of chill out a little bit, and that seemed to be the case with my mom. She was clearly having other problems, but she was much more relaxed about these kind of moral questions at that time. So, yeah, she didn't seem worried about it.
So it almost sort of weirdly at that point in your mom's illness, it kind of made for kind of a perfect point to have that conversation with her.
Right.
Where you didn't have any of the friction that might have happened 5-10 years earlier.
Yeah, and at that point, like, you know, the way our relationship was just with her, we would have done it. It would have happened anyway if we decided we were going to do it, but it did make it easier that she wasn't kind of having a moral quandary about it, at least to us.
So I know you mentioned you guys were in Canada, which obviously has a very different health system than the U.S. But I'm thinking, you know, when I talk to community members in the U.S., a lot of the struggle, a lot of the roadblocks that people face are financial.
Yeah, no, it's exactly the same.
Okay.
Yeah, no, we paid for it all out of pocket.
So did you guys have to make some pretty serious financial decisions when you decided to?
Yeah. Well, and I mean, we coincidentally, for other reasons, we ended up selling a condo, and so we had a chunk of money, and it turned out to be one of the things we could do with it was have kids. But yeah, it was quite expensive. So I don't think it's changed that much in price. So when we did it, the IVF part, including all the like cell biopsy and stuff, was like $20-something thousand, and the genetic testing was a couple thousand. So I think all in all, I think it was about 25,000.
Yeah, and that's just a single round.
One round, yeah.
One round.
Yeah.
And some, you know, mostly with these clinics, it's sort of like we'll go through it and you'll pay the money, and it's not like you get a guarantee that you're going to get a kid, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, because it's possible that also all the embryos could test positive.
Right.
It's possible that you could implant an embryo and then the pregnancy fails.
Right.
You have to go through it all again. Megan, what was the process like for you? Obviously, Jeff, you had sort of the lighter load in this. So what was it like for you?
I mean, it was extraordinarily emotional. When we first started talking to the clinic, even talking to them, they were sort of like putting fear into us about sort of like the process, like, or just not fear, but just sort of like being realistic about how hard it was. And there was a certain point where when we left one day, I was just like, maybe we should just try getting pregnant naturally and doing, you know, amnio.
Yeah, they basically tried to talk us out of it.
They tried to talk us out of it because we went in there, we're like, okay, well, you know, we're young, we're like 2 embryos. And they're like, no, we don't do twins anymore. And then they told us all the reasons why they don't do twins anymore and like all the complications that sort of like happen from IVF. And they're just like, so this is not a good path for you. Yeah, and then when it all sort of like started, it was like I'm getting myself like on a certain cycle that I can make my body ready to sort of like produce eggs and then accept eggs and all the hormones that go along with that. And then I was injecting myself with like hormones to like make my my ovaries grow and produce eggs, right?
We'll fact check this.
Biology check.
Biology. Tell me about yeah. I mean, I can remember being like at a party and having to go to the bathroom and taking my sharps with me and giving myself like hormone injections just because it was the time to do that. Actually, that was in Bellingham.
Weird.
Yeah.
So yes, you have to go through the whole,
Yeah.
you have to manipulate your hormones. You have to sort of put your body in this place where,
It's
obviously
vulnerable.
it's very vulnerable and constantly ready to be pregnant.
Right. And like, bear in mind, like, there's nothing wrong with me. Not there's something wrong with you. But, like I have
fertility wise.
right,
Yeah.
fertility wise, like, I mean, I have the ability to have babies without having to do all of this. So like, I mean, that's also like a really hard question to ask of your partner. Like put them in a position where, they have to go through a rigmarole to get pregnant.
Yeah. But again, it seems like, especially for you guys as a couple, it came down to that question of sort of what are we willing to deal with here? What's
Right.
our price of admission that we're willing to pay to have kids where we know they will not ever develop Huntington's disease?
Yeah.
And I imagine, just as another question for you guys as a couple, how did that impact your relationship at all, knowing that you're going forward this decision that, even though Jeff, you tested positive, that you guys would have kids knowing that they would not develop HD? Did that impact your relationship as a couple?
I think it was. I don't think we really had to talk about it or have that much debate. I think it was just something that we both thought was the right thing, and it seemed a little bit obvious to us. It's just like, we were lucky to be both at that time financially and also just in terms of knowledge to know about this process before a lot of people did, and to have, at least temporarily, the money to pay for it. And so I don't really remember big sort of debates or kind of wrenching conversations about whether we should do it, because it just sort of seemed like the obvious thing to do, in the same way that getting tested just seemed like the obvious thing to me. And not because like I'm so smart and I figured it out, just like that's who I am, that's my personality. It's kind of like, okay, I want to be a problem solver, and we have this problem, granted, but here's this solution, and great, let's like go that way, So I felt like it just felt like the right thing to do for us, which, I mean, didn't make those weeks and months easier, obviously, but at least we weren't debating whether we should do it. It was
Like
just,
if this was the wrong decision to make, like there was none of that. Like it was always sort of like, yes, absolutely, this is the path forward.
The certainty, I think, makes that feel so much less anxiety producing. And I imagine, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, but for you guys as a couple, it also probably lifted some anxieties that you might have had previously about having kids, or your abilities to have a family, what your family makeup would look like. I imagine with knowing that your children would be born HD free lifted a bit of a weight off you guys.
Yeah, and you don't, that intellectually a little bit, but you don't know it until they're, you're past all this madness of the pregnancy and all that, and they're born and they're kids and they're running around, and just like as they were young, a few times I just remember it just kind of hitting me, like in the same way that it hits me every once in a while, that my risk and my status as a mutation carrier is like this huge, bummer that just like lands on you every once in a while. And it's the opposite thing. You look at your kids and you're just like, oh, like, I don't know what's going to happen to them. They'll have problems in their life, but like the worst thing in the world is not going to happen to them. And that's because of like proactive decisions that we made, not easy decisions or not easy processes to carry through with. But it's, it's like the most valuable thing in my life, really.
Yeah. And yes, I imagine as parents also, there will always be things that you worry about. There are always going to be things that you feel. There will always be anxieties with having children.
Yep.
Things that you don't have control over, things that you worry will happen to them. But within this process, you were able to take some of that control back.
Right.
And say, we can at least take this out. This we know will not happen to them.
Yeah.
And we can sort of sleep a little bit better knowing that that's the truth.
Right. I mean, there's always things that are going to happen in one's life, choices that they're going to make independently of us that could like.
Actually, it's bad because we're like, that's not that bad. Whatever just happened to you, it's not that big a deal. Trust me.
Yeah.
Sorry you broke your arm.
Neither of our children have ever broken anything.
Problem with HD is you have this like high bar for bad.
For bad things, yeah.
It's like, you're going to survive. You're going to be fine.
Like, you'll be all right. Shh. I'm wondering, because you guys are very outspoken, you guys are advocates for this process, and you want other people to know what it's like, that it's available, that it's possible to have children who will not develop Huntington's disease. how do you have conversations with other community members or even other family members who maybe chose a different path or who had kids and didn't even know that this was available to them? You know, what are those conversations like? How do you discuss the choices that you guys have made with them?
It's really hard because you don't want to, I mean, you never want to be judging anyone else's family planning decisions, and it's generally a good thing to do in life is let people plan their own family life. You know, I think for us it's kind of a delicate balance of like, I mean, I've been doing this enough now that like at the last convention, people came up to me afterwards and showed me pictures of their grandkids and said, these kids are born through PGD. I heard about it 3 years ago when you talked at wherever, and I talked to my son and my daughter about it. And, you know, not to claim some heroic role, but just saying that like you're connecting these dots and it's like leading to outcomes. And so I feel a responsibility to like at least inform people, not to convince people, but to inform them, because that's a huge gap.
I mean, yeah, information and knowledge is like power.
Right.
You know, like you can make strong decisions about your life having the knowledge of PGD, of testing, of, you know, like of all of these things.
Yeah.
Yeah, such a big message is just in a disease where you feel like you don't have options in so many different ways, the ways in which you can make decisions that will impact your life, your disease course, anything like that. It's sort of like, please know that you have some options. There are some things that you can do. You know, right now things are really limited in the HD world, right? We don't have any disease modifying treatments yet. We don't have a cure yet, but there are some things that you can do to feel like you're taking control of your HD life and potentially your children's.
And I think for me, like, success is not everybody does PGD, because there are people who don't want to do it for whatever reason.
Sure.
For me, success is every HD family member who's thinking about starting a family considers it in an informed way, knowing what the costs and the benefits and all that are, and then decides either that's for us or it's not for us in an informed, sort of thoughtful way. And then that to me is success. Like, I don't think that everybody should do PGD, because for many reasons there's folks that aren't going to do it. But I don't want anyone to not know it's an option. To
feel like they didn't have choices, to feel like there were no, and then potentially live with feelings of anxiety or feelings of guilt, like feeling like they had no other choices available to them.
Yeah.
And I imagine, I know for a lot of folks in the U.S. right now, there is still that feeling of, even though PGD exists, it's prohibitively expensive. So, you know, what do I do if I don't have the luxury of selling a condo, or if I don't have, you know, the luxury of having a job where I can save $30,000 or $40,000 in case I have to go through multiple rounds. But I think the more people get informed, the more they're able to, like you said, Jeff, make a choice for themselves to say, you know what, I know that this might not be my path. I'm going to make a choice about having a family, but I'll know that it was my choice.
Right.
Well, and I also think that the more people that we can reach out to and that know that this is available, the more voices that we have, like together in unison, like we can possibly start to make a change to make this more of a reality where, you know, there is a way to make it affordable. There is a way to make it accessible to people. Yeah,
and I think that's kind of another phase that we're entering in now, is trying to find ways to subsidize or make funds accessible to people. And, you know, we're very like aware of how lucky we were in a lot of ways, many ways, honestly. And so just trying now to think about how do we make sure that it's not just a financial reason that people say no. You know what I mean? And we have a lot of work to do, but that's kind of something we're focusing on this year and going forward.
Yeah, because I imagine for so many people, they might go to their insurance company and say, I'd like to, you know, I can maybe pay for the PGD portion if I can get coverage for IVF. And then an insurance company comes back and says, you're not infertile.
Right.
You know, enjoy paying for this out of pocket.
Yeah. Which is a horrible investment, you know. And so I think, I think the message from us to insurance companies and other people that pay for healthcare needs to be like, look how much cheaper this is than taking care of an HD patient. And so that's, I think, part of our advocacy work over the next year or two, is to really start having those conversations with insurance companies and say, look, it's a lot of money out of pocket, but it's less than a nursing home bed. You know? So
yeah, and even in Canada, like I mean, even though like we're famous for having like free healthcare, like we paid for this out of pocket, and you know, it's like, think about not taking care of, you know, this life.
Well, and there's countries where it's not legal, right? So Germany, it's not an option. There's a lot of places where.
Yeah, I talked about it in Brazil, and I had to be very careful about how I talked about it because it's illegal.
Yeah, and there's the barriers that we face in the U.S. or in Canada are nothing compared to barriers that are faced in other countries.
Right.
Yeah, where the idea of IVF or PGD is just a non-starter.
Right.
Yeah. So my final question for you guys is, obviously this is a process that you went through 12, almost 13 years ago, when, we weren't at a place where we are with HD science right now, and with potential clinical trials. There's a lot of hope right now in the community. There's this feeling like, well, we might be on the cusp of something pretty big. We might finally have a disease-modifying treatment for HD. Do we need PGD-IVF? Is this something that we need to even be talking about still? So with that said, if you guys were 13 years younger and going through this process today, would you still do PGD-IVF?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, for me, until we have a really significant disease-modifying therapy, not just being tested, but actually proved to work and in people and delaying HD or even, permanently delaying the onset of HD, I would do PGD for sure. I think it's an incredibly exciting time for HD research, but I also think, if you have some historical perspective, there have been periods of time, just after the gene was identified and stuff, where people thought, oh, okay, now it's a short, path to the end, and it proved not to be the case ultimately.
Yeah, a lot of people that we've talked to said, oh, but, for my generation, there's not going to be a cure, but for your generation, there is. And
Right.
I think we're hearing that from people now. For my generation, there isn't a cure, but for your generation, there will be, which we don't know for sure because, everybody says that time after time. Also, yes, there are exciting things coming down the pipeline, but I wouldn't want my child to start developing a disease that I can prevent and start getting treatment for a disease that I could prevent. That makes sense?
So even if we have treatments.
Because the treatment right now is really invasive.
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically for me, all the way up until the day there's a perfect, quote, cure for HD on the market, that's a pill you take one time, that's still the right time to do PGD.
Yeah.
Also, there was one day that Elijah looked at me, and I was having a conversation with the doctor about Jeff having HD, and Elijah looked at me and sort of said, well, if Daddy has Huntington's disease, do I have it? And I looked at him and I'm like, no, you are never going to get Huntington's disease. That was one of the clarifying moments for me, was knowing that we did the right thing for our family. Was I could answer that with certainty.
Yeah. So the process, for as difficult as it might have been, for that one moment to be able to say, no, you will never have to worry about this. This will never be your life.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you guys so much for sitting down with me and having this discussion of PGD-IVF, of your process, and the two little humans who came out soon to be teenagers. So thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
And that's the deal with PGD-IVF.